You are now tuned into the truth frequency.
We are TFR. TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
Sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone.
In every revolution, there's one man with a vision.
Captain Kirk, I shall consider it.
I've been a participant in some of the most insidious lies and witnessed to deeds that no crazed man could imagine. I spent years watching you from my lofty position to know that you were the one I could trust.
And why did you lie to me?
There still exist some secrets which should remain secret. Truths that people are just not ready to know.
Who are you to decide that?
The world's reaction to such knowledge would be far too dangerous.
Dangerous? You mean in the sense of outrage? Like the reaction to the Kennedy assassination, or MIAs, or radiation experiments on terminal patients, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Roswell, the Tuskegee experiments. Where will it end?
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth! Get out!
Or what? You'll kill me?
Always remember, dissension's the greatest form of patriotism.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies.
We have before us the opportunity to forge a new world order.
Yes, we can. As you say.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories.
A lie is most convincingly hidden between two truths.
Well, I guess it won't end.
No! I don't have time for this. This is about saving the future of humanity.
We know things are bad, worse than bad. We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad.
The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther.
I want you to get up right now. Go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm a human being. My life has value, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You shall not pass!
You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project with your host, Rob Skiba.
Hello and welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and tonight I'm bringing back Gary Wayne. He was on our show last week talking about his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And so since we've already done the introductions and all that good stuff, let's go ahead and just jump right in. Gary, are you there, sir?
I am.
Sure.
I had my mic on mute. So very happy to be back here tonight and looking forward to another very, very interesting show for your listeners. So we're all ready to go.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of good feedback from the last show, and I know we barely just scratched the surface. Hey, were you? Did you do a show of some sort with John Pounders from Now You See TV?
I've done several with John.
Oh, very cool.
Very cool, yeah. And I've done, I think, 3 video ones with, make it 4 now with John since about October, and I've also done several audio ones. And if anybody's interested in any of those, they're on my website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com, and also on John's website and podcast locations. So yeah, and what he's been doing is sort of focusing in lately on specific topics. So I did one last week on the Templars, and one just before that on the Nazis and the relationship to this whole conspiracy and giants and the mythos that went with the Nazis, and one on Azazel. So it was a pretty interesting show.
Yeah, I just was recently on his show and working with him to edit the video of the show that we did, and he usually puts like other shows that he's done sort of in the right-hand column, like thumbnails. I guess people can click on them, and the whole time I was looking at the video that we did together, I was seeing you up in the top right hand.
Sorry.
No, it's good, man. It's cool. Yeah, it's really good. So I'm trying to remember. I think the last thing we talked about was the Ishtar ISIS deal, chapter 15 in your book, and I think maybe we might have briefly touched on Atlantis, but that's kind of a bigger topic. And if we did get very far on it, we only had a few minutes. So why don't we start there? Maybe as a recap, anything you might have remembered from the last show, and anything else you'd like to share about Atlantis from your research.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about Atlantis, what I like about the Atlantis mythology is that it so parallels the Genesis story that, except that you have to remember that it's from a polytheist perspective. So we have, for example, Poseidon, who is the god, and of course in the monotheist perspective, he would be a fallen angel. And he takes human wives and he creates 10 kings that rule over the Atlantean Empire. And these 10 kings are Titans. And so we have a Nephilim story ruling over one of the major empires of the polytheist belief on the antediluvian world. And so again, and if people aren't familiar with it, with the polytheist belief system, is that they believe there were more than just the Sumerian civilization. There was at least 3 or 4, and if you expand, as I do in this section of the book, which is section 3 that we're talking about, I'll get into the 7 cult centers, the 7 sages, and the 7 gods that set up these cult centers and empires around the world. So when we look at Atlantis, it parallels pretty much what Genesis is talking about, where you have this creation of these Nephilim. They usurp the kingships. They start wars. They're actually trying to take the whole world over. And as they progress, they become more and more and more evil. And they actually rebel against the gods. And then the gods, and they actually temporarily win, but then Zeus steps in, and I'm sure with Poseidon as well, even though these were kings of Poseidon, but the powerful gods, they line up some other titans, and there's this war, and the rebellious titans are sent away to a prison called Tartarus, which again, in the polytheist belief system, not the monotheist belief system, is one of the ways that, because there are several in the polytheist belief system, how the giants survived the flood, that these giants were protected in Tartarus, wherever that is, in the earth, outside of the earth, wherever. There's different variations on how that plays out. But they escape out of Tartarus after the flood. So this whole sort of thing about what happens with the Nephilim in Genesis, it has more context, again, understanding that this is a polytheist belief system in Atlantis, but it parallels the Genesis story. And what's really interesting is, as I get further into the book, whether or not you're talking about the Templars, or you're talking about Francis Bacon, or you're talking about Rosicrucians, or you're talking about Freemasons, or the Royal College, they are absolutely infatuated with this belief to create the new Atlantis. and they call it in today's religion the New Age of Aquarius. But they want to reestablish the Golden Age, which in their belief system is the antediluvian period, and they want to establish it under the model of Atlantis. So this new Atlantis is to have the same amount of empires in it in the end time as they did in the antediluvian time, and that is 10 empires. And of course, anybody who knows prophecy, all of a sudden you're thinking about Daniel and you're thinking about Revelation. And part of this establishing these 10 empires, and this is probably going to talk a whole bunch about it in this show, is the Club of Rome was, as a secret society, was established to make this happen. And so they envision the world's going to be split into 10 empires. They would call them spheres of influence, economic zones, trading blocks, however you want to phrase it, but they already have the world split into 10, but that's later on in the book.
So a couple of questions based on what you just talked about. Now, Josephus likens the first generation Nephilim to the Titans of Greek mythology. And, of course, in the Greek myths, you have the Olympians, which you mentioned, Poseidon and Zeus, and there would also be Hades, overthrowing the Titans. Now, I have seen compelling evidence on both sides of the flood for the Olympians. Do you place them solidly in the pre-flood world, or do you see the Olympians either making a return or originating in the post-flood world?
I clearly, in my opinion, put them in the antediluvian world, and perhaps some of the unimpassioned ones are still out there, because I look at the highest level as fallen angels, as opposed to sort of the lower level of gods in the pantheon. So I would look at the ones that didn't participate in creating giants or other things that might have corrupted the antediluvian world and who weren't imprisoned into the abyss. I would say that they probably were around after the flood as well and were part of the inspiration to the startup of all the different religions and secret societies and everything that happened after the flood.
Have you read any of the works of Dr. Ken Johnson?
No.
He had a book called Ancient Post-Flood History, and he traces the origin of the Olympians in the post-flood world. But like you, I see evidence of it in the pre-flood world. I took a different view on characters like Zeus. A lot of people want to say Zeus is like a fallen angel because he's always coming down from the sky and mating with women and whatnot. But the reason why I took a different view on it was all the stories of Zeus talk about him being born and growing up and dying. So I couldn't reconcile that with angels. I see no precedence for angels being born. However, the altar of Zeus in Pergamum was referred to in the book of Revelation as the seat of Satan. So it just seemed like, okay, well, whatever was going on with Zeus, he certainly had some kind of affiliation with Satan for the seat of Satan to be a reference to the altar of Zeus that was in Pergamum.
Yeah, and I think you have to understand that there are different levels of the hierarchy in the pantheon. And so, for example, and I'm not sure whether we covered this in the last show or not, we might have, but similar to the Anunnaki and the Sumerian mythology and religions. So you have two types of titans. You have a titan that is an earthborn god or demigod, and Nephilim in this case, and then you have a higher form of titan, which is another god, but may not be as high up on the pantheon. And these middle gods may be when we look at what polytheism talks about in their doctrine is that they had the ability to reproduce gods by having gods mating with gods, because they could choose their gender as they came into this realm, to produce a lower level of god. So a Nephilim-like, but only, let's say, a heavenly Nephilim or a heavenly Titan. And so when we look at the Sumerian mythology, they also have the Anunnaki from heaven and the Anunnaki of the earth. And this crops up a fair bit around the world. So it's a consistent doctrine that when they're talking about some of these gods, like let's say Prometheus. And when we look at the Greek flood story, and we have Deucalion and Noria or Nama or Horia or several other names, and depending on which Gnostic gospel that you're looking at or which of the mythologies you're looking at in Greek, as the Noah for the Greek mythology. Well, we're not talking about a human there. We're talking about a Nephilim in that mythology surviving, because Deucalion is the son of Prometheus. And whether Prometheus is another Nephilim or a higher form of Nephilim that is somewhere in between, or a fallen angel, doesn't matter, because Deucalion becomes a Nephilim in that mythos surviving the flood.
Surviving the flood in what way?
On an ark.
Oh, interesting.
Just as Gilgamesh is, and we'll probably cover that a little bit further off today if we stay on this section, that is not a Noah story.
What's not a Noah story?
The Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh, okay. So, go with it.
Let's go with it right now. Okay, fine. So when we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this is all happening in the preamble that I'm talking about. So we have Gilgamesh, who's introduced as this Nephilim king who survives the flood. And he's also, Gilgamesh, his name goes back to the books of Enoch and is recorded. That Enoch was one of the giants that Enoch told that the flood was coming and there's nothing that they can do. So I'm thinking, connecting dots here, that it's probably the same Gilgamesh. So this Gilgamesh is a demigod, as it writes out in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he's produced in the same way all of the giants are produced. And he's a typical role model, evil Nephilim king. He ruled as a king before the flood. He rules as a king after the flood. Now, he is telling the story of the flood story of Ziusudra, or Upnapishtim, to a fellow named Enkidu. And Enkidu is another enunciation of it, but same character. So this character is created after the flood, and as all Nephilim are created, and he is produced to offset the evil of Gilgamesh. But unfortunately, that plan doesn't work out, and they become the best of friends. So now we have, in this Epic of Gilgamesh story, a story of a giant surviving the flood and a procreation of a giant after the flood. Now we get to Ziusudra, or Upnapishtim, and he is the Noah of the Sumerian flood myth. And he is the archetypical Nephilim evil king as well. He is everything Noah is not, and he is a demigod, and he is a giant, and he is of the polytheist belief system. And so on the macro level, the story seems similar, but when we get into the details, that's where the devil is, so to speak. And we find that this is either a copy of the Noah story, is from my biased perspective, or a separate telling from their belief system of giants surviving the flood. And you can look at that both ways, and people will have to make their own decisions on it. So, but when we do talk about polytheism, they talk about giants surviving the flood, and in a number of ways.
Now, I just got your book in the mail a couple days ago. Do you cite the sources for where you're saying that a number of ways? One
of the things that people are most impressed with my book is the amount of notes that I have in there. So there is over 100 pages of endnotes, and it's all there for everybody to look up. That's one of the things that, again, people like is not only are they liking the story, but they're liking all these other sources that they can now go to start looking some of this up.
Oh, yeah. Footnotes are my friend and my enemy.
Yes.
When I see them, I get real excited. I'm like, wow, that's awesome. I can go figure out, where they got this information. But what happens is, and it sounds like probably the same way, I have easily 5 to 6 books at all times in various stages of completion.
Yes.
Because
yes.
I put one aside to go read the, whatever. And I'm like, oh, I'll never get these all done.
Guilty.
Guilty as charged, huh? Yeah. Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad. That should keep me busy for a while when I finally do dive into it.
Yes. So that's and when we talk about these aspects, and again, whether or not you get into the beta ones with Manu, and I'll cite that in a chapter with the Kulian and Amaka Seth, which is a Gnostic gospel individual. It's another creation of a giant, and he survives the flood by going up in a cloud. And the Manu survives an ark with the 7 stages to replant the world with the knowledge to restart civilization afterwards. What I'm doing in this section is I'm not trying to give credibility to the other belief systems. I'm letting them speak for themselves.
Right.
And I'm letting them tell their story in their own words and looking at how it parallels the Genesis story, except it has a different perspective. It is all from paganism, polytheism, from the fallen angels that were ruling the earth as gods before the flood.
Yeah, that was really my take on a lot of the Sumerian epics and stuff like that. Was basically they're just telling the story from their point of view. And we know even in our own history is written by the victor, which means it's not necessarily correct. It can be very biased. And so a lot of these stories that were written, like in the Sumerian epics and stuff like that, were them just putting their own slant on it. And then basically about 850 years or so after the flood, God calls this guy Moses up to a mountaintop and says, okay, get a pen. Are you ready? This is what really happened.
Yeah. And I'll also introduce in this third section about the Aztecs, and not necessarily Aztecs as the original belief system, but take it back to the Quiché Maya and the Popol Vuh and the Toltecs and the Olmecs, and again, the survivors from this Atlantean story with the god or demigod, because it's not clear to me which, that Quetzalcoatl came across to civilize the Mayan and the Toltecs and the Olmecs. But this story, whether it's Osiris in Egypt or several other ones that traveled after the flood to different sections of the earth to replant civilization, and the giants and these antediluvian civilizations, they are constitutive constants in polytheism, and they all tell the same story. And there's whether or not we want to believe that all of these other people survived or not, that's not really, again, my point. What I'm trying to zero in on is that there's stories of giants that are related to the flood. And there's giants before the flood, and there's giants after the flood. And at the end of the day, everybody's going to have to come to their own conclusion how that is. And there are, to me, 3 different ways that could have happened. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's always sort of the big debate in the Nephilim research community. How did they come back after the flood? Because obviously they're there. I mean, they're running into cedar tree size Amorites and stuff. So clearly they're there. And what really drives me crazy is whatever theory you subscribe to, somebody's always saying, "Well, that's absurd. Why would God allow that?" I'm like, well, He's allowing it no matter how you look at it. So whatever your pet theory is, we both end up with the exact same result. And that result is he wanted them there for whatever sovereign reason, because they are there afterwards.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, I look at it, there's 3 ways that they survived. They survived with an ark or some other survival system if they did survive. The second one would there be a procreation after the flood? And then the other one, which the Gnostics do talk about, is somehow as part of survivors on the Noah ark that the giants survived. Now, I don't, in my book, spend much time on whether or not the wives were the seed of the giants, or Ham is, as the Gnostics would suggest, or that it's anybody else on the ark, because I couldn't find enough compelling argument that was consistent to what the Bible was saying from the other sources. So I basically gave examples of how I think you could look at the Bible from, again, and I know people will say, well, just because there was Nephilim before and after doesn't mean that there was a procreation after. But from that perspective, you could interpret it that way. I will provide compelling arguments from other sources. If that did happen, here's some other sources that says where, and those sources generally suggest in Chaldea with Gilgamesh, not with Gilgamesh, with Enkidu, and the other one would be Sodom and Gomorrah, which I'll talk about, because Sodom and Gomorrah was the cities of light and knowledge and the start of the regeneration of the giants after the flood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got about a minute or so before the break, but if you've got your Bible handy, I want to throw two verses at you for you to consider and chew on before we come back. When we come back after the break, we'll talk about them. That's Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 and 19. I'd love to get your take on Genesis 9, 18, and 19, and then maybe we can segue over to Genesis chapter 10 after that, specifically focusing on chapters 10, verses 6 through 20. That should take us on some interesting journeys after after the break. But
I think it's going to be a great discussion.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I mean, when I did my research in my Archon Invasion book, I tried to limit it to the Hebraic sources, meaning the canonized texts, as well as books like Enoch, Joshua, and Jubilees, but still being fully aware of what the Sumerian epics and some of the other ones had to say. I put those aside for another book. Unlike you, I didn't put out an 800-page book. Mine was 300 and change, and I said, okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'll get to that stuff later.
Yeah, I took 25% out so I could get it published.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that. That's like crazy, man. I've been, 1,000-something pages?
Yeah, about 1,100.
All right, we'll talk about it when we come back.
With Chris and Shuri Geo. Friday and Saturday on Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and tonight I'm talking once again with my guest, Gary Wayne, about his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And right before the break, we were discussing some of the possible ways that the Nephilim giants may have returned after the flood. And I asked you if you could check out Genesis 9, 18, and 19. Did you get a chance to look at that?
I did, and I think you're probably looking at the Curse of Cain.
No.
Okay.
No, I'll read it for you. Genesis 9, 18, and 19. And the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham is the father of Canaan, which I find rather interesting that he decides to throw that in there. Next verse. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth populated. So, to me, from a biblical standpoint, anyway, that's a pretty conclusive statement. The whole world, 850 years after the flood, at a time when giants were running rampant in the land of Canaan, which the spies would then later see. The land is full of these guys of great stature. The land consumes itself, etc., etc. Moses says, point blank, the whole world was populated by these three guys.
Or the people were scattered over the earth from these people. depending on which translation that you're looking at on that. So I understand that point, and that's a very, very, very clear point. So if the point is that other people didn't survive the flood, then the giants must have come from them, and if so, how? And I don't discount that. But I also don't look at that as being absolutely, I would say, let's see, what's the right word, conclusive.
Well, yeah, if you were to take, see, this is where people get real funny, because some people go completely ballistic on you if you do anything but solo scriptura. If you deviate from the canon, they'll go berserk on you.
Yeah.
But
and the reason why I say that is sorry to interrupt, Rob, is that if we look at a few other people that are in the Old Testament, in several of the books. And so you've got other giants that aren't related to the descendants of Canaan, whether they be Anak or Rephaim, and I'll make a case in my book, Amalekites, and I'll make some other ones. And I do make distinctions between certain kinds of giants and the ones that either came from the Ham lineage or the Canaanite lineage, or that Japheth and some of the sons and descendants of Noah married into them to become hybrid giants. But where I'm going with this is, if I didn't lose my train of thought, is that there are other peoples that aren't giants that are listed, and so there's like the Kenizzites and the Kenites as two that come to mind right off the top of my head, and they don't go back into the Table of Nations, and their history would suggest that at least they believe, or as people have talked about them, is that they take their lineage back to Tubal-Cain and to Cain. And then there's the Gerzites and the Geshurites as well, which has the sort of same kind of connotation to the Amalekites and who they married to, and the unknown existence of the Horites. And again, I know there's going to, and we'll probably be getting into this because you and I are really into this as giant geeks. The difference is, was there a error made in describing the Horites and the Hivites? And you may not go there, I don't know, but I know that's one of the arguments that are out there. But my point is that there's these other peoples that don't go back to the descendants at all in the Table of Nations, and they sort of come out of nowhere.
Let's see. Genesis 10:15 through 19 talks about the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, Sunites, Arvadites, Zamorites, and Hamathites. And all of those are mentioned in many of, or not all of them, but a majority of them anyway, are mentioned several times throughout the Torah as well as the book of Joshua as those that are marked for utter destruction.
Sure, but it also doesn't include the Avites, it doesn't include the Amites, the Ozim, the Zamzunites, and other peoples, right? So I'm not disputing that the Hittites or the Hivites, and certainly the Amorites, weren't larger people, and they may have been giants, or they could have been hybrid giants. They could have been offspring, interbred in a larger form. For me, it's an either or. All I do know is they were totally corrupted after the flood, and that they were considered giants in most sort of writings. But were they pure Nephilim? That would be the argument.
Numbers 13:33 says that these were Nephilim that came from other Nephilim. So, and clearly after the flood, you start to see a marked decrease in size.
Yes.
From like upwards, if we take a cedar tree, Amos 2:9, as a scale, a small, modest cedar tree gets to 35 feet. The cedars Lebanon got to 150 feet, but erring on the small side. Let's say the Amorites were, as described by Amos, cedar tree size, but when you get to Og Bashan, who is an Amorite, he's only 13 to 15 feet, depending on how you read. And Goliath.
Well, depending on whether it's a royal cubit or a common cubit. Right.
That's why I say depending on who you read, depends on what cubit they're going with. And Goliath, same thing. He's anywhere from 9 to 12 feet, depending on who you read. So they're definitely shrinking. But the Amorites, they're mentioned 85 5 times, I believe, in Scripture, and the Philistines are mentioned over 200 times.
Yes.
And Philistines come from Caphtor, son of Mitzrayim, son of Ham, who stepped off the ark with no mention of angels. So,
and I'll connect them back to being either a hybrid giant or a purebred that goes way back, like what you're saying. But when you're talking about Og and Sihon as being Amorite, they're also Rephaim.
Yeah.
And they were noted in Deuteronomy and in what's the other passage? Deuteronomy. Anyways, as the last Rephaim,
the remnant.
Last of the Rephaim, the remnant of the Rephaim, depending on which translation, and one even is as a last surviving Rephaim, and that's Joshua 12:4 and Deuteronomy 3:11. And what I find really odd on that, because that's why you want to be very careful, or people ought to be very careful to being too dogmatic, even though I want to be, and I know everybody wants to be, is how could they be the last of the Rephites? Because and I'll trace all the way down, and I'll come back to maybe some more examples in around this time. But I'll trace Goliath in the Goliath story as being a Rephaim, and we know there was more Rephaim that were around after Og. So unless they're talking about a pure race that is distinct and different than the Amorites, it's hard to fathom why they would say that. But again, I don't like to get too dogmatic on what any one saying says, because I think the Bible adds to it. It doesn't contradict itself.
Yeah, I agree. It does not contradict itself. It's taking a strictly biblical world. You're not paying attention to any of the other writings. It seemed to me that all of the biblical giants that we read about traced back to the people of Genesis 10:6-20, and Doug Hamp actually did a really good job of tracing where the various names came from, and how, in many cases they weren't different classes or different breeds or what have you. It was just the way a different people said, that, well, we call them this, well, they call them this, and he was showing in Scripture how it, in many places, actually says that. I forget which ones they were. Let's say these guys called them the Amims, and these guys called them the Zamzamims.
Yeah.
So he was showing how there was the tie. And when I was looking at the Rapha,
biblically, Rob, to underline your point is that Anak, we're told, send from Nephilim, but we're also told that Anak are Rephaim. So you've got one or two breeds there, because they're all saying the same thing. And then you have the vernacular names that come in. And then there's the Amalekite Horite thing that might be a little bit different case.
Yeah. Well, in any case, they're back.
They're back.
they're back and in the land and doing their thing. Do you think, well, let me ask you this. Why do you think a large population of them settled the land of Canaan?
Well, I think they were instructed by their gods and their religion and their priests, because, again, they were, in my view, all of this works together both before and after the flood. And that's what my book speaks to. So they would have known that when the earth was split up in Deuteronomy 32, that the land of the covenant, the land of Israel as we know it, was God's land.
Yeah,
and that
that's right.
They would have known that if there was going to be a challenge to the giants, that this land was going to go to the people of the hope of humankind, the future Israelites. And I write in my book that they deliberately went there and laid in wait in ambush to prevent the nation of hope from fulfilling their destiny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me ask you this: would you care to elaborate on why that land is God's land?
What I could not find out anything in my research as to why he chose that land, other than he did choose that land.
I don't know if you probably haven't seen the series I did called the Yahuwah Triangle. In part 2 of it was a 3-part series that I added 2 other parts to it after I finished it. But when it was a 3-part series, it was part 2. finding the Garden of Eden and a show through the Bible that I believe Abram at the time was the key to showing us where the garden was and where the two trees were in the garden.
Wow.
And so,
and
cut
that
to
would
the
make
chase,
sense.
Canaan is the garden, the land of Canaan that we now call Israel, is the Garden of Eden.
And that's interesting. If you get a chance, send me some information on that, because that's kind of one of those things that I've wondered about as to why that area was chosen.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have said Eden, but I couldn't find anything to back that up. So yeah, I think that's terrific, and I think that's also one of the points about all of the people that write in this genre is it shouldn't be competitive. I think the whole thing is about how do we learn more about it and how do we advance the knowledge, and everybody has their expertise and everybody has their contribution, and I think most of the time people are in agreement whether or not they want to get split off on a nuance here or not. That's the small picture. The big picture is there's more and more information coming out all the time because of writers like yourself, and hopefully I can be considered part of that crowd as well.
Yeah, well, that's why we do shows like this and try to network and compare notes. And Paul says we all look through the glass dimly, and the way I interpret that is like we're all looking at the same big picture from different angles of this dented, blurry glass. And I got a little bit of detail here. Oh, you got a bit of detail there. Well, let's put them together, and maybe we can piece together the overall picture.
Right.
If we can all.
Yeah, and I think that's the way we do learn about these things, because this subject is, as you know, it was probably one of the things that you found frustrating has been sort of shelved in Christianity, and there's no mention of science or anybody pursuing this, and you are really out there if you're pursuing this sort of inquiry and belief that this actually happens. So the more we can get this information out, the more credibility it brings to the whole genre.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me go back to your website here. Zep Tepi. I've always been intrigued by Zep Tepi. You've got that chapter 18 the first time. What's up?
Yeah. So again, this section 3 is the global testimony about the antediluvian period and the giants and the flood and what it was like. And so Zep Tepi comes from the Egyptian version of the antediluvian world, again filled with giants. And again, they have their hierarchy of gods. That goes back to the antediluvian epoch, that is, again, trying to be replicated after the flood. So what is Zep Tepi? That's the first time. That's what that translates to. That's the golden age that you'll hear of, whether it's in Roman mythology or in Greek mythology. And you'll hear that in a number of mythologies, but it's this time of plenty. It's this time of Eden. It's this time of long lives and no disease and all this food. And this is talked about whether it's in Atlantean mythology or in subcontinent Indian mythology or even in North American Aboriginal mythology. Anywhere around the world, we have this golden age that took place that went awry. And it went awry because of the introduction of these giants who started to slaughter people, who even drank blood, and that's where the whole vampire thing comes in, and I'll talk more about that in my book in later aspects of the book. And the whole world became corrupted, and the gods had to bring about the flood to start anew again. So again, Zep Tepi is just another story of the first time. And what I do in that chapter is I bring in a whole bunch of other things about Egyptian gods and things like that, just to give some education and, again, show the consistency in the story from around the world.
Yeah. You can definitely see that. I mean, not only just in their stories, but in architecture and stuff like that. What's your take on the worldwide creation of pyramids?
Well, I don't buy the standard chronology by Egyptologists, and I'll give some examples as to why in my book, from why they're dated to before the flood. So I don't buy that. But the real issue to me is who built them. And I do believe they are older than the 23 to 2400 BC that Egyptologists like to date it to. But it's interesting that when you get into the Freemason history of the antediluvian world and their mythology, and I use their mythology and their legends extensively, particularly when we're talking about the legends of Enoch and we're talking about the evil Enoch here and his descendants, is they actually attribute that this building skill of masonry was used to build these monuments and inclusive of the pyramids. Mm-hmm. But that's letting them talk for themselves.
Yeah. When you read the book of First Enoch, you see that he was shown all kinds of, the heavenly tablets, and he was seeing the heavenly books, and he had full knowledge of all of them. And he came back for a period of time before he was finally raptured, and he was not, for God took him. He taught everything to Methuselah, and then you read Josephus's account on it, and he said that the sons of Seth were the ones who built a monument in Egypt that was based on a prediction that Adam had that the world was going to be destroyed twice, once by fire and once by water. So they were to build two structures, one of brick in case the fire was first, and one of stone in case the flood was first. Well, we know the flood was first. And by Josephus's description, I would say it certainly sounds like that the monument of Isaiah chapter 19, which is also described as being in the center and the border of Egypt, is the Great Pyramid of Giza, most likely the architect thereof being Enoch, passing the blueprints on to Methuselah in the house of Seth. And then other ones seem to be copycats.
Yeah, but let's also bring into this discussion as well the ziggurats of Sumeria.
Yeah.
And so a little bit different construction format, but still the same type of sacred geometry involved, still building a mountain. And I wonder whether or not, and the same thing that happened at Babel after the flood, and I wonder whether or not they're trying to recreate Mount Hermon.
Oh, interesting.
In inviting the gods to come back down and do either another procreation. And also what's interesting about the Babel Tower is we look at the translation from a Hebrew perspective, where that means the confusion of languages. But from the Akkadian translation, that is the gateway of the gods.
Yeah.
So El being God and Bab being gateway. Yeah. And so I wonder whether or not there's a lot of that religious sort of symbology that's going on there. And also in the Freemason, and believe me, you can't believe how much information the Masons have on this. They believe that the people in the antediluvian time were organized into communities and into civilizations to build monuments to worship the gods, and great monuments. And then in the other legends, that's where you get into the evidence where possibly it was them and their sciences that built the pyramids before the flood.
Yeah.
I don't know who built them.
Yeah, well, I mean, all of us would be speculating anyway, because, especially like the Great Pyramid, which is funny because most of these temples and whatnot in Egypt have hieroglyphs all over the place, honoring the pharaoh or, the campaigns of whoever was alive during the time it was being built. And, they're really proud of their stuff. But here you have the most impressive structure on this earth that doesn't have any writing on it. Or at least if it did, it may have been on the 144,000 casing stones that have been since removed. It just seems really bizarre, unless it wasn't meant to ever honor a pharaoh, unless it had another purpose.
If it had anybody that was of this world, they'd be, in that position, they'd be honoring themselves. They'd be falling all over themselves to get their inscriptions on it some way. And the Egyptians have left a lot of inscriptions.
Ooh,
that was built into their culture. And, we have the same type of pyramids over in Central America. And again, archaeology likes to date those again to being, a couple thousand years old at the oldest. But again, if you talk to the people there and their mythologies, is that they say they didn't build them. It goes back into prehistory. and then there's Machu Picchu, and you've got all these different things that were going on before the flood that just make no sense from what modern secular science and archaeology likes to tell us. And when you're talking about hieroglyphs, and again, this is coming from what the Freemasons believe, and Enoch, the son of Cain, they believe, and also Orientalist writers, but they're Gnostic and polytheist as well. But so understand that bias. They believe that Enoch invented the first writing and the hieroglyphs as part of this development of these sciences. And they did that so that they could keep track of the knowledge and keep track of the laws and the rituals for this new sun-worshipping religion that they were developing, that Enoch the Evil was, because he was a sun worshiper. And I'll talk all about this in the book.
Do you? I don't remember if I asked you this last time or not, but I'll ask it again. Either way, do you believe that the Tower of Babel was built over or in the same region or vicinity of a previous structure that may have?
Yes, and Eridu is the place, as I recall.
Yeah.
And I'll give some Sumerian mythology that backs that up, and it's a story of Babel that is pretty much identical, but again from a polytheist perspective at Eridu. And what you also might find amazing is I'll also give an example of a Babel being built that is in the Aztec and Central American mythology. Now, I'm not saying that. What I'm not saying on that is that there is different Babels around the world. All I'm saying is I find it amazing that we have Genesis account being duplicated again in other religions around the world.
Yeah.
And they also, these other ones will bring in giants as helping in the construction, and that the builders of Babel and Babel City were able to draft these giants to help them or enslave them, depending on which mythology that you're looking at.
Yeah.
Now, again, I want to state this just for the listeners again, because I did on the last show, just so that people don't misunderstand what I'm saying, is I weigh everything on what the Bible says.
Yeah.
And I add this other stuff as context and say, okay, here's another source that's saying the same thing, but this is what the Bible says.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've got to have a standard for truth, and I'm the same way. It's like, okay, this is the touchstone, so we can look at this other stuff, and it's valuable information.
Yeah.
And where it does not contradict with Scripture, wonderful. You might have a few more pieces to add to the puzzle. Where it does contradict, well, I'm going to err on the side of Scripture then, and it's like it chew the meat, toss the bones kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's also one of the reasons why I didn't go too far down the line of either the wives or the sons being the source of the giants after the flood, because that's a distinctly Gnostic belief, and from not necessarily the wives, I don't talk about the wives, but from either Tubal-Cain or from Ham as being a giant that was inserted into the last survivors to survive the flood. So I'd like to be kind of careful on that I don't like to inject something that I know can't be true.
Oh, well, this is where we would definitely differ. I don't know where you get that it's a Gnostic source, and if somebody believed that. But for me, I have not read Gnostic material. I stuck strictly with the Bible and came to the conclusion that all the post-flood giants trace directly back to the occupants on the ark, most notably Ham, but also Japheth, because Gog and Magog throughout history were known as giants.
Yeah, and what's kind of interesting on that, because again, it's an either or, but if we're saying then that the sons of Noah were giants.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
No.
So then if they're not giants, then it's got to be the wives.
That's all you're left with. And
that's all you're left with.
They don't need to be giants either. Because I don't believe a Nephilim is strictly a giant. I think when you talk about the animal-human hybrids, the satyrs and all that stuff, they're every bit as much a Nephilim as it's an abomination. It's a hybrid. It's, oops, off the break. We'll talk about that when we come back.
No hate, no hype, no fear. We are EFR, your protection from deception.
Back on the Revolutionary Radio Project for the second hour. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and I'm talking with my guest, Gary Wayne, the author of the book Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And right before the break, I was talking about the idea that Nephilim are not necessarily just angel-human hybrids, but could be just hybrids in general. And one of the reasons I would say that is because in Numbers 13:33, it says that the Nephilim that they encountered were Nephilim that came from other Nephilim. So you have at least two types of Nephilim then. You have angel-human hybrid Nephilims, and you have hybrid Nephilims that were the result of Nephilim mating with either other humans or other Nephilim or what have you. And I simply extend that definition to include things like satyrs and minotaurs and centaurs and these creatures that are depicted by numerous ancient cultures. So I wanted to get your take on that. Do you think that they, with all the cultures making depictions, carvings, paintings, and whatnot of animal-human hybrids, do you think that was all just, everybody being inspired artistically to create fiction, or do you think there was some basis in reality to those creatures?
Yeah, I think it's so heavily tied to their religion and their mythology that I don't believe it's imagination.
Yeah.
And so let's look at the Minotaur, and in the modern Rex Deus mythology, they call it the Quinotaur, but it's the same animal. And this is the bull human hybrid, whether it's DNA or sexual copulation. In this case, it's a god mating with a bull as punishment for King Minos, as I recall. And so this Minotaur eats babies, and people believe that the Minotaur is the same belief system and possibly the base for Moloch of the Bible, who also had babies sacrificed to him. And so the story revolves around Nephilim again, and Theseus comes over to help free the Athenians who are being sent there for sacrifice every year, and overthrows the king and rescues everybody. But this is all part of the same mythology. And then we look at centaurs, and of course they were made in a cloud again. So is that like up in the heavens? Is that in a spaceship? Is it DNA manipulation? Who knows? But there's something going on that's consistent. And if we go over to India, they got some very exotic ones as well. They've got these gods that have elephant face, and some other really bizarre-looking ones. And then we have the Pegasus, and on and on and on and on around the world. There's these very strange hybrids. I mean, there's too many to list. So, I think again, when you have that much, and it's that common in so many cultures, it's demonstrating a common heritage. And so from that, my conclusion, even though it's speculative, is likely true.
Yeah. I was when I was a missionary, I was able to go to Greece a couple times, and it was on my second trip that I was hanging out in Cyprus and Athens and all in that general area there. And you can't really look anywhere without seeing the toppled remains of a temple or a statue of a god or some representation of a animal-human hybrid. I mean, it's like everywhere there. And I was, when I came back from that trip, and I told my wife, I said, all those animal-human hybrids in like Greek mythology? She said, yeah. I said, it's just so prevalent, that I was thinking, if it's all just myth, like we were told, Homer's Odyssey and Iliad and all that was taught to us as mythology. Well, I mean, George Lucas said that he was creating a new mythology with Star Wars. And I was thinking to myself, man, 4,000 years from now, nobody's going to remember Yoda, But yet these people, the Greek people, I mean, it's still very much a part of their culture. So much so that a friend of mine told me when I was referring to it as mythology, he said, "Rob, stop. You keep calling this mythology, but in my schools where I grew up, they taught that to us as history." And I said to my wife, I said, I think that stuff was real. And, we had a nice conversation. She went to bed. Next morning, we both wake up, and she's checking her email in the other room and says, come here. And I came in there, and she had clicked on an RSS news feed that said that scientists had successfully cloned a sheep with a human heart. And the article went on to say, if we keep this up, eventually the genes are going to fuse together, and we're going to end up with animal-human hybrids and have all the ethical issues that we're going to have to deal with, in that regard. I'm going, that was like the next morning after I thought, I wonder if those were real. Well, they're real today.
Yeah, and to me, it's a little bit arrogant and dismissive to write off all of these mythologies around the world when those people from those areas believe it is their history. It's not just the Greeks.
Yeah.
They don't believe it's mythology.
Yeah, and it's a rather sobering thought when you realize that Yeshua said that the last days in Matthew 24:37 would be like the days of Noah. And anytime I talk about that, I always remind people, well, we always think of Noah's Ark. That's what he was most famous for. But the guy lived 950 years, 600 before and 350 after. And there's weird and wild, crazy, wacky stuff going on both sides of the flood. Do you think we're going to actually – do you think that the last days are indeed going to directly parallel the days of Noah?
I think there's going to be a lot of similarities from technology, advancing rapid, uncontrollable technology to hybrids, and if we look at Revelation, we already know that there's demons and there's these creatures who are probably the descriptions of fallen angels coming up out of the abyss. I think we were instructed by our Messiah to understand the days of Noah, and he even goes on to say, they were eating and drinking so that you understand it's around the flood period. And so I think it's got to do with all of those aspects of what was happening in the first apocalypse by water, that the second apocalypse by fire, the circumstances are going to be the same. Again, that nothing is new under the sun. But even if it is after the flood, which I'm not part of that, I do recognize that Babel with Nimrod and Hermes and the starting of the seven sacred sciences and mysticism, and again at Babel with the wise men and the Chaldeans and everything that flowed out of there afterwards. And Nimrod is an antichrist figure, and at least from a biblical perspective, those are the only people on earth, and he's got full sway like an antichrist with the universal religion that is the religion of Babylon. I think you can look at that on either side of the flood and say, take your own parallel. I'm comfortable with both.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a sobering thing. In fact, I had to get my wife's brakes and shocks, rotors replaced in her car. I was sitting in the lobby of the mechanic shop there, and there was a free publication called the Dallas Observer, something like that. And on the front cover, it showed a X-ray of two hands with microchips embedded in their hands. So I thought, I'll check this out. So I'm reading the article, and the whole thing was about transhumanism and how there's this mad rush with people who like to tattoo themselves and pierce their tongue and their nose and whatever else and put things in their bodies are like jumping all over this whole thing of putting microchips and things in their body to modify themselves. And it was like this whole rave thing that apparently Dallas is like a big hub for this techno-hybridization transhumanism deal. And I'm like, wow. I mean, between that and what scientists are doing in the laboratory, I mean, we are rushing headlong right exactly into the days of Noah. And it's my feeling that Genesis 6:3, where it talks about that they had 120 years, was the warning flare that went off and said, basically, guys, if you don't knock it off, you've got 120 years. And then I'm going to wipe everything out. And I feel like we're now taking our steps into that last 120-year warning. Hello?
What's that?
I don't know. That was weird.
It's like it was like a jet flying over.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting again, and then people, you can look at that 120 years. Is that the length of the life of the antediluvians before the flood, or was that limiting life to that age? And I know Josephus, who you like to quote, and I like to quote as well a lot, he actually notes that was the years that the giants were going to be permitted to live for. But again, we're slicing details on that, which when we get into this whole aspect of transhumanism, this is still the Nephilim doctrine, and it's the new man doctrine as modern understanding would have it, that came up with the progressive new movement and the Nazi movement with genetics, and transhumanism is just an extension of that. And if we look at how this connects through, and you talked about the knowledge exploding at Babel, and again, I'll talk about this in the book to a certain degree, that this is when the 7 sacred sciences were redeveloping at Babel under Hermes and Nimrod, and that anything that working together as one people in one language, nothing would really be preventable, or that they could almost do anything that they wanted. And I think that's a reflection on this knowledge that they're talking about. But this whole knowledge base, new man, Nephilim, superhuman thing is all part of this polytheist doctrine. And if you look at how science was created, it was started, the modern era of science transferred from, let's say, sorcerers and magicians, as they would call themselves, to the Royal Society in about 1660. Well, who was this society created for? And what was its purpose? Well, this was created all by Rosicrucians and Freemasons to honor the great architect of the universe and to find out knowledge and more knowledge about the great architect of the universe, who is Lucifer, in their belief system. All of this is the same story being told all throughout history. It's the same religion and the same philosophy.
Yeah. Nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun.
Okay, let's get a little deeper here in your book. What's the people of the plain, chapter 28?
The people of the plain is just a story of the people coming down from Mount Ararat and just before Babel, and how Nimrod takes over. And so I'm telling in that, bringing in a lot of Jewish mythology, and they have a lot of history that they have in their mythology, and I'll use Louis Ginsburg as my main source for Jewish mythology, and he was considered one of the giants of getting the various myths.
No pun intended.
Yeah, so to speak, yeah. And he has several books, so I lean on him to sort of bring some Jewish additional information to the table from a mythological perspective. And so I'm just sort of preparing at this point in that section of the book of the people of the plain for Nimrod and Hermes and what he had set up and what he tried to do in the chapters.
What I mean, I've always kind of joked about it. If their goal was to build a tall structure, why would they build it in a plain? It seems to me that if we go the route of an enclosed circular world under a dome, it may make a little bit of sense. But it seems like if they're actually trying to get into heaven, they would start on top of a mountain, unless it was some sort of a Stargate type of scenario. Is that sort of where you go with it, or what's your thought?
Yeah, it's a shrine for sure, or a monument, and to who? And it's obviously not a monument to God in terms of respect, because God doesn't let it be completed. So it's obviously then a sign of disrespect or honoring their own gods, and that arrives at the same end. And so a lot of the mythology will have Nimrod climbing up and creating these terrific speeches, similar to an Antichrist figure, on how if God ever gets out of line again, he'll climb this ziggurat and he'll fire his arrows and he'll slay this evil god because he's not stronger than the gods that they worship. And this whole thing about why they built it is just honoring their gods, and it could be to recreate Herman as a Stargate, and this is speculative, but it could be. But I do believe there's a correlation there to honor Mount Hermon, where the giants were created, because the society that Nimrod created was like a Nephilim king would do, and so Nephilim or Nimrod would either be a Nephilim or a Nephilim hybrid or a Nephilim wannabe. I fall on the perspective, and a lot of people think he's giants, but I've come down on it just from my own research and speculation, is that he probably wasn't, because he's in the Table of Nations, and but I also respect that a lot of people think that he was a giant. But at the end of the day, we have the giants, we have the 7 sacred sciences, we have a manifestation of this religion, these sciences, and what the giants like to do in a pyramid, which is what they were building, and it was either to have the gods rejoin them to procreate, rejoin them just to rejoin them, or it was to honor Mount Hermon. All of it leads to the same end, in my opinion.
Yeah. I lean toward the idea that he was not born a Nephilim, but that he genetically modified himself because of the way it's worded, not only even in the English, but also in the Hebrew, but specifically the way it's translated in the Septuagint. That was it Genesis 10, 8, and 9, I believe. It says in the Septuagint point blank that he became a giant. But the word began in Hebrew it's used, the same word is used elsewhere for defilement, prostitution, usually has some sort of sexual connotation to it. So at least it appears that through some sort of sexual manipulation of some kind, he may have modified himself. And I wonder, and it's speculation, but I wonder, because Jubilees tells you that Arphaxad had a son named Canaan, not spelled the same way as Canaan, and his name is omitted from the King James Table of Nations, but it's in the Septuagint. And Jubilees says that he found some writings after the flood from the Watchers, and all it says is, I think it's in Jubilees 8, if I remember, it says that he sinned because of it and hid it from Noah for obvious reasons. But if that's true, if that story is true, then he's a direct first cousin with Nimrod. So it kind of makes you wonder, did maybe these two get together and Nimrod, figure something out? I don't know. It's just kind of weird.
Well, yeah, Nimrod is in the Bible because of its infamy.
Right.
What level of that infamy is, I mean, the Bible's quite stingy on him. But what we do know is what little is written there. He acted like a Nephilim, whether he was or not. Yeah. He was either one or he wanted to be one, but he certainly ruled like one and took it to an Antichrist-like figure.
Oh, certainly. I believe he's the first, absolutely the first Antichrist figure whose goal was to not only kill God, but set himself up as God. The Joshua account goes into a lot of detail describing what his plans were. And there's an interesting piece, though, where God does the judgment on them. There's 3 camps. They each had different assignments. In one camp, God caused them to just kill each other off. And one camp, he turned them into like apes and elephants. And you mentioned the Hindu pantheon earlier, and 2 of their big gods is Ganesha and Hanuman or something like that. Ganesha being the elephant head guy, and the other one being the monkey head guy. And so it kind of makes you wonder if that story is to be taken literally, if that whole group of people who went away from the Tower of Babel as mutants or some sort of abomination went off and settled the area of India and became the gods that we see over there.
Well, what we do know from history is that the religions of India, Buddhism, and then the religions that went to China, whether it's Confucianism and over to Japan, that's all has the same root that was exported out of Chaldea.
Yeah.
And I'll cover that information off for the reader in the book as well. So, if that's true, and if it's true that there was these elephant-type figures that you were just talking about, and we have those elephant-type figures of gods in the Vedas and in statues in India, makes sense.
Yeah.
And I wasn't aware of those elephant figures till tonight.
Yeah.
in your account there.
Yeah, it's well, whatever the chapter is in Joshua that covers the Tower of Babel incident describes that, and I was like, "Well, wait a minute," because I had been to India. I was a missionary in India for a while, and
oh wow,
you could see. I mean, those things are. I mean, wow, it's everywhere, you know. And they got some bizarre ones over there, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So, and then of course the remaining third, were the ones that God confounded their languages. And so it's interesting because when you got the other third leaving the Tower of Babel, all talking about the same guy who was the emperor basically of the world at the time, Nimrod, now he's taking on other names. And and then you start seeing various depictions of a sort of a hunter, war / agricultural god. That many of which the synchronicity is too in your face to ignore. That it appears to they funnel right back to this one guy. So
yeah, and I think the god is it Nimru that they merged them with in those writings.
Well, there's several. Ningirsu was an earlier representation of Ninurta, who was a war / agriculture god. That eventually they split. They took the agriculture part out and the war part out, made two different entities, to symbolize those. And interestingly enough, those two are symbolized in the front entrance of our nation's Capitol building. You have Mars on one side and Ceres on the other.
Yeah. Amazing how that happens. All the other Egyptian symbolism that's also in Washington.
Yeah, big time. Well, okay, let's see. Moving on. Let's see what else we have. Okay, what is when you're talking about the curse of the Amalekites?
Mm-hmm. Curse of the Amalekites. Okay, so that is following the destruction of the Amalekites, and the curse comes from Moses and from God for attacking the Israelites when they were still sort of a worn-torn, ragtag tribes of, slaves that had just come out of Egypt. So Amalek, who is from another line of Abraham. So you have, when that split up, you had Jacob and you had Esau, and so Amalek descends from Esau, I believe it's his grandson, and so the Amalekites are these people that are trying to usurp the Abraham covenant, the Messianic covenant, and the birthright covenant that they thought their ancestor should have had. But they did not get it. And so they attack Israel first when they're weak and not ready for battle, not trained, and Moses and God look upon that, and most of the listeners out there who are familiar with the Bible will know this story, that they looked upon that in disdain as the worst thing possible. And so this curse remains, and the Israelites are instructed that after they've taken the promised land and they have a land of peace, that then they will go back and take out their curse on the Amalekites. But the Amalekites, the reason why I'm talking so much about the Amalekites is that there was a giant in prehistory named Amalek, and that it's not clear whether or not Amalek of Esau started the tribes and nations of Amalek, or this descendant of Esau actually took the name of the Amalekites. And so when I look at sources, whether it's Unger's or Nelson's on dictionaries and encyclopedias and that, this Amalekite nation is very, very unclear, and I'll make a case in the book that they're probably the Horites. Or there's two different tribes there, but they have this ancient sort of history, and they have this antediluvian connection, and I'll follow that through. But at the end of the day, they were either a hybrid set of giants, a purebred set of giants, and I'll lay both of those cases out, and they attacked Israel right in the beginning of the Exodus. And when I'll make a case further on in the book with King Saul and King David that part of their covenant, their kingship covenant, was to finish dealing with these giants and wipe them out, and Amalek was included in that.
Yeah, we just read it in the Torah portion last weekend in the book of Exodus, that there's basically never going to be any peace for the Amalekites. God's just going to, he's got a vendetta.
Well, and what makes them unique is the Amalekites swore a blood covenant to wipe Israel from the face of the earth.
And God's like, oh yeah?
And so the punishment was leveled in equal proportions to them because secular history does not record the Amalekites.
Oh, interesting.
Only in biblical history. And so it is absolutely divine proportioned judgment for how they were judged and what they were trying to do. Again, I do believe that they were trying to usurp the birthrights and the Messiah birthright in as part of taking that whole succession of those gifts into the Nephilim bloodline.
Okay.
And I'll lay that out in the book so that kind of makes some sense. Because you are talking about two different peoples. You've got the Amalekites that descend, as the grandson of Esau. Then you've got marrying into these tribes in the land of Seir, and where did these people come from? And they amalgamate into this great Amalekite nation.
Well, Ishmael marries into the Canaanites, and later Esau marries into the Ishmaelites.
Yes.
So, and Arab means mixture.
Yes.
And so, it seems to me that's where we see the bloodline crossing over, was when that happened. Assuming the Canaanites are, in fact, by and large, Nephilim. Back to much more.
The Kev Baker Show with Kev and the crew, Monday through Thursday on Truth Frequency Radio.
And welcome back to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba. For the final half-hour segment of this broadcast, I'm talking with my guest, Gary Wayne. We're talking about his book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Gary, where can people get your book and find out more about what you're doing and what you've written?
You can get my book through my website, www.genesis6conspiracy.com. If you want a signed or personalized copy, that's Genesis6conspiracy.com with a 6. It's also available through Amazon, Amazon.com, CA, all the Amazon onlines around the world. It's also available through Barnes & Noble, online and through their stores. They're not stocking it in Barnes & Noble on the stores, but they can order it. It's also available on most online bookstores around the world, and if you want to go into your local Christian store, to a bookstore to buy it, you can get it through them as well if you would like to support them. My book is distributed by Send the Light Distribution, who supplies the Christian bookstores.
Oh, very good.
If you're looking to follow me, you can follow me at Gary Wayne 63 on Twitter or on Facebook as Gary Wayne, and I also have a couple of Genesis 6 conspiracy pages on there as well.
Yeah, and I can say if you go to his website, Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and that's with the number 6, Genesis number 6, conspiracy.com, you can click on the tab where it says the book, and he's got section 1 through, looks like section 8 there. And what I've done is clicked on section 1, and he's got little snippets, don't you? You get like you've given a generous portion, it looks like, from each of the chapters for people to read.
I have a very generous portion so that they can get a bit of a flavor and a bit of a flavor as to how much information is going to come at them.
Yeah, and so we've been sort of going down the column on the right side there. When you click on that, he's got his chapter outline there, so I'm just kind of going through them and sort of randomly picking some interesting things to talk about. What about the chapter 40, the new man? What's going on with what's the new man?
Well, now we're moving into the modern period, and so I end the section 3 with the Goliath story and the Avites and King David and his men hunting down the last of the Rephaites in the land of the covenant. At least that, as far as we're told in terms of the Bible of the giants. So now I'm moving things forward into modern time because I want people to understand that what happened in prehistory is very relevant to what's going on today in all aspects. And so section 4, where the new man is that I am making a transition into biblical prophecy and how things were similar back in the time of Noah as what they are today. So in the chapter of the new man, we're talking about different aspects about what a modern Nephilim might look like, and that we're very quickly closing in on the ability to do our own DNA manipulation, if that's what we want to do to create superhumans, or could it be a alien DNA manipulation and start talking about maybe who these aliens are, and I'll cover more of that as the book unfolds, whether they're demons or different species or fallen angels. But certainly if we look at prehistory, there was a DNA manipulation. And I'll also start to introduce the concept of the new man concept, which is the modern incantation that we talked about of a superhuman. Whether it's bigger, stronger, smarter, lives longer, whatever it is, it's the same philosophy that's going today that was in prehistory. And, of course, now the popular word is transhumanism. So I'm just easing the reader into where we're starting to go.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so segueing from that then to the age of Aquarius.
Yes, and again, talking a little bit more of the age that we're in and how the polytheists will look at it, that they have end-time beliefs and end-time prophecies as well, whether they're 100% accurate or not, but they do have this rendezvous with destiny, this new age where there will be the opposite of what we think as to who's going to be the weeds and pulled out, and that the age of Aquarius is the new age millennium. And I'm now introducing this belief system into and sort of shadowing what it does with prophecy, and that they also believe that in the new age of Aquarius that this epoch ends in apocalypse as well, and by fire. And I'll lay that out in terms of how they believe that. So again, just sort of moving this forward into some of the more major prophetic aspects of what section 4 will talk about.
Okay. So yeah, it looks like we're moving progressively into more, deeper territory, at least from our context anyway, segueing into the modern times and the New World Order and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so section 4 is, most Christians will be quite familiar with prophecy, and I'm just laying out not a detailed aspect of all of prophecy, because those are many, many books in themselves, but just like the major issues of prophecy and introducing what the other side talks about, preparing them for what I'm going to talk about in the rest of the book, and that how they're going to bring about the end time.
Yeah, excellent.
And also introducing characters and thoughts and philosophies, whether it's the secret societies or the alien phenomena or the Gnostic religion or terms like the disciples of light and the children of light and who these people are. But it's not in super long detail, because we're trying to cover off in here just the main characters, and then the last sections will really start to dig into these aspects.
Very cool. So then what is the sign of Noah?
Well, the sign of Noah is essentially the what we had talked about earlier, in terms of what Jesus had said about the days of Noah.
Okay, so it's the
and it will be like the end time. And so again, I create the parallel, and just because I'm also trying to hit readers that aren't familiar with the Bible. And so I'm going to say what the New Testament says about what the end time is going to look like in terms of people and what it looks like and what happened in antediluvian times. And I'll sort of parallel those in a couple of chapters there.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'll also move, as we're moving forward into here, we'll get into the Babylon chapter, Babylon City, and I'll describe who Babylon is, and that I'll break down Babylon as being a combination of almost government-like, but a religious government that works with the New World Order, but a religious center and a business center of the world. And that this is the new Atlantis. This is Tyre, as Isaiah describes Tyre and its destruction and what Tyre was like. And I'll use three sort of metaphors from the Old Testament. One would be Tyre, the other one will be Babylon, and I will also use Nineveh to describe the different aspects of what this future Babylon was described by the Old Testament prophets. And I'll also link in that from the polytheist perspective that this is their new Atlantis city.
So So Babylon is a model for the new Atlantis?
Yes.
So then,
Babylon is the new Atlantis
from
a city perspective and from a religious, dominated government perspective.
Yeah, an ideology.
Yes.
So I know several scholars who subscribe to the idea that the United States is Babylon. I personally do not share that belief, but I do believe that we are fully immersed in a Babylonian system, and that Francis Bacon and company had the whole idea behind setting America up was for America to be the new Atlantis.
Well, a model for the new Atlantis.
Yeah, or to bring it about.
Yes, and to be a significant player in bringing it about.
Yeah.
And now what they're trying to do is reel it in. And so the new Atlantis would operate similarly with not as many states or empires, but maybe they are within the empires. But so you have one central government, and you have these mini-states that are working together. And so they have a split of power, but the main power and the tax levers and everything is in the central side. And they don't really care whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. They'll push it from either side. But eventually the democracies will be usurped.
Yeah, or Democrat or Republican.
Yes.
we end up down the same path either way.
Yes. And so I will give all Babylon is to really start to coalesce what the end time is going to start to look like from a religious perspective, but not from a government perspective, even though this dominates the government, and that Babylon has to take place first before the New World Order empire takes place. So it's just one of my personal doctrines. Not that I'm going to stand on it as being infallible, but if I look at prehistory, is I look at a number of things that are consistent. So, at Babel, for example, we had the religion first, and then we had the government, and then we have the Antichrist figure. And in the antediluvian time, we had Enoch and the religion, and then we had the Nephilim come along, and they're trying to establish their world government, and then one rises to a level of Antichrist-like figure. And I think it's going to be kind of similar in this end, so that the Antichrist actually just sort of takes this whole thing over when they usurp three of the empires.
Yeah, when our troops pulled out of Iraq in 2011, December, there were a bunch of reports that followed showing how we left 500 military bases. We built the largest embassy in the world in ancient Babylon area, and we left behind hundreds of millions of dollars of state-of-the-art military equipment. And my comment at the time was, wow, we sure did set somebody up. Here you go. It's all set for whenever you're ready.
Yeah, what did we think was going to happen by doing that?
Yeah, they were saying, well, sometimes it's too costly to ship these things back. I'm like, really? It costs more in shipping than it does in manufacturing to make an M1 Abrams tank. Really?
Yeah, really. And somehow it's a good idea to fund all of these rogue factions that are over there with weapons. I don't think so.
Yeah. So, you've got an interesting chapter 45. It just caught my eye. Reflections from within the Third Reich.
Yeah. So what I'm laying out here is because I'm throwing a lot of things at people, and I'm going to throw a lot more as the next chapters roll out. Is let's now talk about a semi-modern parallel example that we can look on that will be very similar to the end time, and that's what the Nazi regime is. And the Nazi regime has the Antichrist figure with Hitler, and it's trying to set up its Third Reich, which is a reign of 1,000 years, which is the false millennium. It has its own religion, and that's what people don't understand, that the Nazi regime had developed their own church by 1933, and it was distinctly anti-Christian and distinctly anti-Semitic. And this regime and this movement was set up by the secret societies and Theosophy, which developed into what they slanted into a version called Ariosophy, and that's the Aryan aspects that's coming in. And so they were imposing their own religion. They had their own government set on world government, that they wanted to take over the whole world, and I know some people dispute that, but Hitler wanted to have the whole world, and he was going to have his religion over the whole world. And we have the Holocaust that took place with the Jewish people. And what's really interesting about this religion that Hitler had set up, it was distinctly not only Theosophy or Gnostic, but it was occultic. And it had its own variation, as we talked with Ariosophy. So they introduced a couple of concepts into Theosophy that made it distinctly Nordic and Aryan. And those two things are playing at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about Vril.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and that's a Rosicrucian doctrine. But it's a potency in the blood that will sponsor a future race of superhuman beings. Okay, so now we have this blood thing that's going on, and these super beings. And I know there's a lot of speculation of Rh negative. I'm not linking that. I think Rh negative is interesting. All I know is what the Vril is, and that's something special in the blood that comes out of prehistory that's going to produce super beings. And they overlaid another idea that was, and just before I move on that, Vril is also a belief in a doctrine based in race purity and bloodlines. And of course, these bloodlines go back to prehistory. And Volkisch ideology, also known as Das Volk or folk soul or the new man concept, again, to create this new Nephilim. So we have all of this brewing, just as what we did in antiquity and what will happen in the end time. And of course, Volkisch ideology that is overlaid on this religion and in their whole political doctrine, it's based on a hero cosmology or a hero collective. And when I talk about hero, I'm talking about ancient Greek and Atlantean heroes. And this is the inclusion into this Volkisch ideology of the Thule, which is the Aryan ancient or Aryan antediluvian society of Atlantis. And so they believe, as the Aryan concept, that they are descendants of these Aryans from Atlantis, or giants. And this whole blood Nephilim thing interbreeds. And so all of this comes together in this awful, horrible thing in Nazi Germany. And I think we can look back and I'll lay out a number of interesting things in this chapter for people to look at, that take a close look at this as a religion, as a government, as a belief system, as a political belief system, and what they did as to what's going to happen.
Yeah, they were, like the Nazis were obsessed with this whole thing, but I read somewhere that like most of that came out of a fictional novel. But I guess you'd have to ask yourself, where did the person who wrote the so-called fictional novel get all this information?
Well, they relied on a number of people. It's not just any one idea, any one person. So I'll name a few just so that, and this also includes Grail mythology, and which is also why it fits in my book, because later, the next section of the book is going to get into the Holy Grail and those bloodlines, and King Arthur. And again, this is all related. But so Helen Blavatsky would be the founder of Theosophy, so a very, very important figure influencing Nazi and its belief system. Then you have Stefan George, and he was a writer and a poet and a Gnostic of Theosophy and an occultist, and that's where he coins the word Führer. And also Wagner is also heavily influencing the Nazi movement. And right after seeing a Wagner a concert, a theater, that's when, in 1933, after that, for inspiration, Hitler goes out and announces his Reichschurch. There's von Liszt, there's Jorgen Lanz Liebenfels, there's Sabetendorf, there's so many other people that were affecting and pulling this whole thing together from all these whole bunch of different levels of Germanic society, and different organizations that were also funding these groups. So we have different orders that were being developed, and these are secret societies and rogue Freemasonry movements that are working together with this Volkisch ideology and this Gnostic religion. Some other important people who had heavy influence on this whole movement would be Dietrich Eckhart, for example, or Hans Horberger, or Elfin Rosenberger, who is probably one of the most important people in establishing the Nazi doctrine and was the Nazi theoretician. And he was also in the Thule Society, and Ernst Bergman and Rudolf Hess and the Teutonic Knights that they bring into the SS, which goes back to the Templars. This whole thing is absolutely immersed in this occultic long history, and it all manifests itself in what I believe is a similar parallel account of the end time, with Hitler being a wannabe Antichrist figure. And he looked at himself as a Messiah-like figure.
Well, I can imagine anybody who was living at that time, who was a student of Scripture, they had to have been thinking, this is it. This guy's got to be it.
Yeah, and the swastika logo comes right out of Eastern Buddhism and was adopted by Helen Blavatsky and several other of these people as their symbols and their seals that they were using on their writings and things at that time. And you also have to understand that Rosicrucian orders were a big part of this, and people talk about Aleister Crowley as being part of the Golden Dawn. Well, he associated and supported the Nazi movement, and the Nazi movement was also funded by the major banks. And the reason why they were bringing along the Nazi regime is another belief system that they had originally funded went rogue and got out of control, and that was communism. So they were placing Nazism in place to take care of the first problem, and then Nazism got out of the box and out of control.
Yeah. Do you think? The reports were that Hitler shot himself in the head, and end of the war and all that stuff. But recent forensic evidence shows that wasn't even a male skull that they had found, and that he apparently survived the war, took off to, some say, Argentina or Antarctica or whatnot. But the Nazis are still very much in power. I think they just sort of changed outfits.
Yeah, they are. Well, we have to factor in one other thing, that history is continually being rewritten by the leftists and the occultists and the Gnostics, and so progressives were just the Western, sort of North American version of National Socialism, and so National Socialism has been rebranded by our education system as right-wing fanatics, but they are a socialist movement. They were a socialist movement, except that they partner with private enterprise as with oligarchies and or corporations. At the end of the day, they're kind of a similar term in terms of how they're used to further the state and the profit, so that all the wealth belongs with the adepts. And so we have to understand that this reframing of Nazism today is just misinformation. They're lefting. The only thing that the Nazis, as National Socialism were right of, was pure socialism, communism, and anarchism. And most people don't realize this.
Well, but we also, with the space program and Project Paperclip, and we brought a whole bunch of these guys over here, and they basically just took over.
Yeah. Well, they were so far ahead on their technology.
Do you think they were tapping into with some pre-flood type stuff, or fallen angel technology, or Nephilim?
Well, they believe that they were talking to avatars and spirit guides and angels, and it's part of the theosophy belief system that you converse with them. So it is not beyond the possibility on that type of speculation that they receive knowledge to advance their weapons. It's something as mundane as their Tiger tanks and the other tanks that they had were so far superior to what the Allies had. The only reason why they didn't succeed with that is because the Russians and the Allies, Western Allies, could produce way more through their, and so defeated them in sheer numbers. But now we move on to, where did the rocket technology come from?
Right, that's the big question.
Where did the single fixed wing stealth technology come from? Where did the jet engine come from? And I don't know whether
you're belt from the Nazi bell.
That's what I was going to end up with, is where did that Nazi bell technology come from, and what was it, and why does it look like the tops of ancient monuments in the East, as in Vietnam or Thailand or places in Southeast Asia? It's unbelievable. And what were they going to do with that? So somehow, and they were able to do this in such a short period of time. They were a military non-factor in the late 20s. And by the early 40s, they are the most, or the late 30s, early 1940s, they're the most powerful military force on Earth. And a couple of years later, they've got these fancy weapons that they're developing that just come out of nowhere. Yeah. And they would have probably developed the atom bomb if the Allies hadn't bombed the heavy water plants.
Yeah, clearly something happened. Something changed. They even talked about, we did receive inspiration or whatever from elsewhere. And then, of course, we got like a minute left of the broadcast, but the big question is, why were they so obsessed with Antarctica? And, many say that that's where a lot of them went, and so did we. Boy, when you get into Operation High Jump and Deep Freeze and following, man, the United States, it was like, okay, here we have two world wars, pretty close to each other, and then, of course, we got Korea, and then getting ready for Vietnam and everything, too. But then all of a sudden, everybody's like, hey, let's go to Antarctica.
Well, they were obsessed with anything Aryan, and there's a lot of mythology that they're chasing, that Atlantis actually exploded down to Antarctica, and the Grail halos that they were chasing like crazy as well.
Well, that's all we have tonight.